So this morning we're continuing our sermon series on 40 days of prayer. And today we're going to talk about how to pray in a crisis. How to pray in a crisis. I want to start with a story today about test pilots. Has anybody in here ever flown an airplane before? Anybody ever taken lessons before? I think it would be cool to take lessons to learn how to fly an airplane. But test pilots have a litmus test for evaluating problems. And when something goes wrong, they ask this: is this thing still flying? That's what they ask, test pilots. Is this thing still flying? If the answer is yes, then there's no immediate danger, no need to overreact, because they don't want to overreact at the controls of an airplane. That has been put into practice many, many times with pilots. And one example of that is it had to be put into practice when Apollo 12 took off some time ago, many, many years ago. The spacecraft was actually hit by lightning when it took off. And the entire console, just put yourself in these astronaut shoes for a moment. The entire console began to glow orange and red with trouble lights after it got struck by lightning. And you're on that thing going up. Had to get struck by lightning. And there was a temptation to do something about what had happened. To do something. But the pilots, those astronauts, asked themselves, is this thing still flying in the right direction? That's what they asked after it got struck by lightning. Is it flying in the right direction? And the answer was yes. It was headed for the moon. It had not stopped. It was still going in the right direction. So they let the lights glow as they addressed the individual problems and watched orange and red lights blink out one by one. And that's something to think about in a pressure situation. You see, application. If your thing is still flying, think first, then act. If your thing is still flying, think first, then act. How does this apply to you and I? Sometimes crises happen as we're flying through this life. I know we all fly at different speeds, but flying through this life, and we must think first, do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but it belongs to God. 2 Chronicles 20:15. The battle belongs to the Lord. Look at your neighbor and say, it's not your battle.
Not your battle.
It's not your battle. I don't know about you, but it's really easy to make it your battle or want to handle it as your battle. But when crisis has happened, it's not your battle. It's not your battle. It was talking about King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20:15 that I just read. Why was King Jehoshaphat told this? A crisis occurred for him. A crisis occurred for him, but not only him, for his court, for his people, the people of Judah. And you find that in 2 Chronicles 23-4, if you want to turn there. 2 Chronicles 23-4, you'll see his crisis that he had. 2 Chronicles 23-4. Messengers came and told Jehoshaphat, a vast army from Edom is marching against you from beyond the Dead Sea. They are already at Hazon Tamir. This was another name for En-gedi. Jehoshaphat was terrified by the news and begged the Lord for guidance. He also ordered everyone in Judah to begin fasting. So this had a reaction to him. When he heard this army was coming, he was terrified. So there was human emotion mixed in it. Just like when we have crises, there's human emotion mixed into it. And so he had human emotion. The army of Judah was no match for this vast threatening army that was coming. There was no way. This was not going to work. They were not going to win. They were not going to be able to handle it. They didn't know what to do. There was no way there was going to be a good outcome out of this in the human eye from what Jehoshaphat could see and seeing that army. And maybe for us sometimes when we look at something and see it and frame it that way in the human eye, it doesn't look like it's going to work out. It doesn't look like it's going to be handled because our human eye sees it and it looks big, but God sees it a different way. You see, today we're going to discuss how to pray in a crisis, and there's 6 lessons to learn from Jehoshaphat here. 6 lessons to learn. So here's the first lesson to learn from Jehoshaphat. Turn to God for help. Turn to God for help. 2 Chronicles 23. 2 Chronicles 23. And just want to say thank you, Larry, for running the sound, and thank you for running the PowerPoint and sound booth things. I appreciate that. It says, Jehoshaphat was terrified by the news and begged the Lord for guidance. He also ordered everyone in Judah to begin fasting. Now, there's two human tendencies that we have to watch out for during a crisis that we can experience. Here's the first one, pride. Pride can come up in the midst of a crisis. And it looks like this, or sounds like this. We act like we can handle it ourselves and do not turn to God or to others for help. We don't open up, we don't share, we don't let the crisis be exposed to God, where we got it, God, I'll do it myself, or I'll do this and nobody's going to help me. And so that's one of the ways that people can respond. A U.S. Air Force transport plane with its captain and 5 crew members was flying over Alaska in the mid-1950s when they entered an unusually fierce snowstorm. The navigator contacted an air base and only to be told that he had veered several hundred miles off course. Correct coordinates were given to the navigator, who continued to insist that his own calculations were the correct ones and that he was not that far off. Soon the plane ran low on fuel. The 6 men decided to abandon the plane and parachute to safety, but because of the negative 70-degree Fahrenheit temperature and winds that gusted 50 miles per hour, they were all frozen within minutes of hitting the ground. A friend of mine was part of the rescue team that discovered and retrieved the bodies in the story that I'm telling. I was part of it. Retrieved the bodies 3 days later. As a result of the navigator's pride, 5 other people went to their deaths. We have to watch that our pride doesn't hold us back, that we can't turn to God when we're needing help, or we can't turn to other people when we're needing help. The pride has to be put to the side. It has to be let down. You know, it says in Scripture that God exalts the humble, but he abases the prideful. Our pride has to go down where we can get help from God, and we can get help from God's people also. So instead of pride, another thing people do is giving up. Giving up. We just throw our hands in the air in the middle of a crisis and say, I give up. It's not going to work out. Not worth it. Whatever you want to say, whatever it looks like, instead of turning to God or letting God use his people in that circumstance. So instead of pride or giving up, we have to turn to God. That's exactly what King Jehoshaphat did. Now, he had a human emotion. We talked about it. He did have terror. But did you see he immediately turned to God even though he had a feeling? His feeling was not greater than, I'm not going to turn to God. He turned to God instead, even though he had a feeling. He asked God for guidance. God, what do we do? This army's huge. Our army isn't that. What do we do? What do we do about this, God? We need your help. And then he called a nationwide fast where everybody gave up eating to seek God for what to do about this army, that God will protect them and help them. We should never let a problem intimidate us. Instead, it should motivate us to pray. Don't let it intimidate you in a corner that you've got it yourself or that you're just going to give up. Instead, you turn to God or you allow God's people to help you. Seek God for wisdom before you do anything else. There's some things to remember when we turn to God during a crisis to continue this on. Here's one of the things to remember, and I'm just thinking about things we've talked about in service this morning. It's always neat how things tie together, but we talked about some of these things. Remember how big God is. Remember how big God is. 2 Chronicles 26. 2 Chronicles 26. This is what Jehoshaphat prayed. O Lord God of our ancestors, you alone are the God who is in heaven. You're the ruler of all the kingdoms of the earth. You're more powerful and mighty. No one can stand against you. So he said, you alone are God. When he turned to God in prayer about the crisis. You alone are God. As God, he was over the kingdoms of the earth. He was bigger than any enemy king or any enemy army. He was bigger. He has authority over your crisis too. It cannot control him. God is not boxed in because of your crisis. He is still in authority, and you're going to a God who is big. He's big enough to handle your circumstance. As God, He's powerful. He's more powerful than your crisis. Powerful there, if you look it back up in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament, means powerful means to be firm, vigor, literally force in a good sense, or figuratively capacity. Means and able to produce ability, able, force, might, power, and strength. In other words, there's nothing that's going to come up in your life that God is not going to be able to handle. We might not be able to handle it, but He's always going to be able to handle it. And so we turn to the one who can handle it. It also describes God there as mighty. He's mightier than your crisis. Mighty in the Hebrew there means force, literally or figuratively, by implication. Valor, victor, master, or strength. Mastery or strength. I don't know about you, but when we face a crisis, we need that victory, and He is victory. He's victory in the midst of your crisis. As God, no one can stand against Him, and nor can your crisis stand against Him. It's not too big for Him. Another thing to remember as you're praying is remember what God has done. And this isn't the other points yet. This is still talking about when you turn to God, things to remember. Remember what God has done. 2 Chronicles 20 in verse 7, the very beginning, it says, "O our God, did you not drive out those who lived in this land where your people Israel arrived?" So when Israel got to the promised land the second time and was going in, you got to realize that there still were enemy armies inside and fortified cities inside of the promised land that they would have to take. And unlike this first group who said, we can't do it, except for Joshua and Caleb, the second group entered in by faith, and God fought the battles for them, and they did take the land. They did take fortified cities. They did inhabit and take hold of the land. And so King Jehoshaphat is remembering back what God had done for Joshua and Caleb and the Israelites when they inherited the promised land. Think about it. They had marched around a wall and shouted, and the walls of Jericho fell down. They didn't do that. I mean, I don't know if they had bad voices, but their bad voices aren't enough to knock down the walls of a city. All right? God did that for them. That was not humanly possible for it to happen, that they could knock down the walls of a city just by marching around it and yelling. One by one, the enemies in the promised land were defeated by the Israelites, though they should not have been able to do it in human strength alone. Now, the same God can make the walls of your personal Jericho crisis fall down. Not in the way of you handling it, but in obeying Him in the way He tells you to handle it, to go around those walls. He can make those walls go down. Another thing to remember when you're turning to God, remember what God has promised. Remember what God has promised. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7, the last part of that verse says this, "And did you not give this land forever to the descendants of your friend Abraham?" Can you just imagine it? Jehoshaphat is praying. He knows his army's coming. He's turned to God in the middle, and you know what he's remembering? God, I know that you gave Abraham this land, and you said that he would have it forever. So there is no way this enemy army is going to invade and take over right now. You said forever we would have the land, so this isn't going to happen. He's quoting back a promise to God. He's believing a promise to God because God said it wasn't going to happen. And what God says, God does. And so he was quoting back a promise to God. He did not matter what he saw, what he felt, or what he heard. It belonged to them, the land. It didn't belong to that enemy army coming in. God said it. How could the enemy army win? God said the land belonged to them. So one of the things we do when we turn to God in the middle of a crisis to pray is claim the promises of God for our situation, the things, and say, God, you said you would do this, and I'm believing you for that. And so you hold on to that promise that you have. Next thing when you're turning to God, appeal to God's character. Appeal to God's character. This is 2 Chronicles 20, verse 10 through 12. 2 Chronicles 20, 10 through 12. Why appeal to His character? That's a big question. Why appeal to God's character? Here's the reason why. He never changes. He never changes. That's why we appeal to His character. So look at the verses there, 10 and 12. "And now see what the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir are doing. You would not let our ancestors invade those nations when Israel left Egypt, so they went around them and did not destroy them. Now see how they reward us, for they have come to throw us out of your land, which you gave us as inheritance. O our God, won't you stop them? We are powerless against this mighty army that is about to attack us. We do not know what to do, but we're looking to you for help. In other words, what Jehoshaphat was doing in essence was he was saying, I know who you are, God. I know what you've done. I know what you've said. And I know what you can do. And I'm asking you to do it again. Let me say that one more time. In essence, Jehoshaphat, in the way he turned to God and prayed, was, I know who you are. I know what you've done. I know what you've said. I know what you can do, and I'm asking you to do it again. He can do it again. Look at your neighbor and say, he can do it again. No matter how many times he's done it for you, or no matter how many times he's done it for others, he can do it again. All right, here's the second. Admit my inadequacy. Admit my inadequacy. You know, thinking about inadequacy, I remember the first time I ever preached. Westway Baptist Church here in Huntsville. I'd been called to ministry after going to Pineywood Baptist Encampment in 1992 and came back and said, I'm called to pastoral ministry. Please give me things to do. I want to work. I want to, serve God and do things. And came back. And so they gave me the Wednesday night services for a while. Brother Roger Hoopturk did. And I remember the very first service that I ever preached. And I thought, I wrote everything down. I didn't really look at anybody. I spoke straight off the sheet, sweated completely down, and finished in 10 minutes. That's how long, about 10 minutes. I did later tell them, maybe they need to get somebody else to do Wednesday nights because I needed more training. But here's the deal: inadequacy. God made up for my inadequacy because He developed me. He developed me. But we have to admit inadequacy. We discussed this a little, but we'll discuss a little more now in detail. I want to share this illustration with you. Alex Talley, the author of Roots, has a picture in his office showing a turtle sitting atop a fence. The picture is there to remind him of a lesson he learned long ago. If you see a turtle on a fence post, you know he had some help. Alex explains, anytime I start thinking, in other words, turtles don't get on top of fence posts by themselves. It doesn't happen that way. Anytime I start thinking, wow, isn't this marvelous what I've done? I look at this picture and remember how this turtle got on that post. See, thinking we're adequate for a crisis puts us on a fence post like a turtle trying to get off. I've got it, I can handle it, I'll do it, I've got it. We're just getting on the fence post. And I don't know about you, but if that shell sits on the flat of the top of the fence post, all that turtle is doing is this. Trying to get off. And maybe the head's going in and out, I'm not sure. But that turtle is just spinning, is what's taking place. It's not getting off. And that's what we do when we say, I've got it. I'm adequate for this. I can handle it. 2 Chronicles 20:12. O our God, won't you stop them? We are powerless against this mighty army about to attack us. We do not know what to do, but we're looking to you for help. So Jehoshaphat, in humility, said, we're powerless. When's the last time that you were honest enough when you faced a crisis to say, I'm powerless? No, we're American culture. I've got it. Through thick and thin, I can handle it. I've got it. We can't show weakness. But the reality is, he turns to God and says, we're powerless. God, I can't do anything about it. What's about to happen, I can't do anything about it. I can't. We're powerless against this mighty army that is about to attack us. He continued, and I don't know what to do. When's the last time when you're in a crisis that you were honest enough to God or even to others to say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Because that's how transparent or how vulnerable he was. Are we able to say, I'm powerless to handle this crisis and do not know what to do? Miracles never happen until you admit the situation is impossible without God's help. Let me say that one more time. Miracles never happen until you admit that the situation is impossible without God's help. It's not happening while you're saying, I've got it, I've got it, I've got it, I'm going to do it, I've got it, I've got it, I handle it, I handle it, I handle it. It happens when the guard is dropped and you say, God, I can't do it, I have to have your help. Where he has his entrance into the situation to help. See, Matthew 19:26 says, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Yeah, you might have impossible situations, but with God all things are possible. And so be vulnerable about it. Next, rely on God's resources. That's your next blank on your handout going through. Rely on God's resources. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 12, the last half of that verse. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 12, the last half of that verse says this, but our eyes are on you. But our eyes are on you. So they did not have the power to handle it. They didn't know what to do, but they did know to turn their eyes on God. Turn their eyes on God. You see, in a crisis, we have to shift our focus from our problem to the problem solver. To the problem solver, and not keep it on the problem. A sign in a textile mill read this, when your thread becomes tangled, call the foreman. And a young woman was new on the job, her thread became tangled, and she thought, I'll just straighten this out myself. She tried, but the situation only worsened. Finally, she called the foreman, and she said, I did the best that I could. She said, no, you didn't. To do the best, you should have called me. Sometimes the best thing we're in the crisis isn't that you're doing the best that you can, because the best you can isn't going to solve it. It's in the middle, letting the foreman named God turning to him, and he's going to do his best, which always is right, and always is going to win, and always going to turn it out for our good, and always going to be loving. And so, it's not about our best, it's the best thing to do is depend on God. Also, another illustration. Some years ago, this is talking about a gentleman that was learning to fly. The instructor told him to put the plane down in a steep, extended dive, and he was totally unprepared for what was about to happen. After a brief time, the engine stalled and the plane began to plunge out of control. It soon became evident that the instructor was not going to help him. After a few seconds, which seemed like eternity, his mind began to function again. He quickly corrected the situation, and immediately he turned to the instructor and began to vent his fearful frustrations on him. He very calmly said to me, the instructor said this to the guy, there is no position you can get this airplane into that I cannot get you out of. If you want to learn to fly, go up there and do it again. And at that moment, God seemed to be saying to the instructor, through the instructor to the one learning to fly, remembering this, as you serve me, there is no situation you can get yourself into I cannot get you out of. If you trust me, you will be all right. That's a lesson that has been proven true in this gentleman's ministry. He wrote that illustration over the years. Sometimes you just got trust. Seems like a nosedive, but there's no nosedive God can't pull you out of. He is in control. 4, relax in faith. Relax in faith. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 15, and verse 17, and verse 20. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 15, 17, and 20. Jehoshaphat said this, listen, all you people of Judah and Jerusalem. Listen, King Jehoshaphat. No, this is someone else saying. This is what the Lord says. His prophet said this. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged by this mighty army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. But you will not even need to fight. Take your positions and stand still and watch the Lord's victory. He is with you. O people of Judah and Jerusalem, do not be afraid or discouraged. Go out against them tomorrow, for the Lord is with you. Early the next morning, the army of Judah went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. On the way to Jehoshaphat stopped and said, listen to me, all you people of Judah and Jerusalem. Believe in his prophets and you will succeed. So, when you put your life in God's hands, your battles become his battles. All right? Your enemies become his enemies. And God says to you, just like he said to Jehoshaphat, relax, I've got this. I know it's harder to do sometimes than easy to say, but relax, I've got this. And just trust him in faith. You go, well, what if my faith does some wavering? You know, when the people came to Jesus and they said their faith was little, They said, pray for us, our faith. They just said that. Well, ask God to increase your faith then. You go, well, my faith has to be gigantic or God's not going to do anything. Well, the Bible actually says faith is small as a mustard seed to move a mountain. And that's pretty tiny. That's how faithful our God is. But putting the trust into Him. I remember many, many years ago when I worked at the Anchor Christian Bookstore in Baytown, I met a gentleman that he told me his story about how he had come to know the Lord. This guy was a gangster. He was a real troublemaker in Baytown. Lots of illegal things taking place. But this one church would gather for prayer meeting and they would pray for him. They would call on his name and pray for him in Baytown. His life would be changed and his life would be altered. In case you ever wonder if prayer makes a difference in other people's lives, even if they don't know you're praying for them. Or if they do know. And they would call on his name and call on his name. And actually his name was Jojo. I just thought of it. His name was Jojo. And Jojo was driving by that church and just felt compelled, didn't know why or anything. He just said, I have to pull in here, I have to pull in there. And flew into the church parking lot, got out and walked through the back doors of the church. They were having a prayer meeting and they were praying for him. And he got saved that day. He got saved and came to know the Lord. I later had him be a guest speaker at a church that I was a youth pastor at to speak. But the really cool thing how God altered his life and how praying changed his life was he went to Central Bible College up in Missouri, Assembly of God Bible College, and he always, because of how he had got saved, he really was witnessing to people all the time because he knew for the priority of witnessing, what it impacted his life, changed his life. So he was at the post office one day, and he was sharing his faith with people, and he shared his faith with a gentleman named Warren Triplett. Now, I know the name doesn't mean a whole bunch to you, but I'll give you the insight of that name. We laughed when he told us the story. That was the head of missions for the Assembly of God, and he was witnessing to him at the post office. But his life was changed by prayer. So faith, that faith of those people in that building praying for him faithfully, pulled him into a parking lot and changed his life to send him to Bible college. So pray. Pray with faith for yourself, for other people. And don't get all caught up on the amount, but just realize, ask God for help with it, and it only takes small as a mustard seed to do it. And so relax in faith. Fifth, thank God in advance. I thought this one was pretty cool. I'd never noticed this in reading the story of Jehoshaphat in this battle that they're going to face before. Thank God in advance. All right. 2 Chronicles 20:21 says this. After consulting the people, the king appointed singers to walk ahead of the army, singing to the Lord and praising him for his holy splendor. This is what they sang. Give thanks to the Lord, his faithful love endures forever. Now, think about it. The battle had not been won. There had been no battle. There was no victory yet. The enemy army was still setting out there larger than Israel's army. Nothing had changed to the physical eye at all. In defiance of human thinking, the king appointed singers to give thanks to God. You know, there could have been a little crowd over here on this side, the woe is me crowd. Woe is me, things are horrible, we're going to be defeated. But then, instead, there was a crowd over here that it still looked impossible to the human eye, but he appointed singers to sing. To sing. You see, thank God for what he's going to do, even though you don't know how he's going to do it. Thank him ahead of time for what he's going to do, even though you don't know how he's going to do it. If you thank him after the fact, that's gratitude. You notice there's a difference. Gratitude is when you thank God for something he's done. This other is about doing it before. But if you thank God in advance, that's faith. Thanking him in advance. Thank you for doing this for me, Lord, and it's not happened yet. Doing that. You see, Hebrews 11:6 says this, and without faith it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he will reward those who seek him. He will reward you for seeking him. Give thanks before it happens. Give thanks and I'm going to get this job, Lord. Give thanks my finances are going to be okay. Give thanks this is going to be taken care of. just give thanks ahead of time. 2 Chronicles 20:22. At that very moment, they begin to sing and give praise, and the Lord caused the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir to start fighting among themselves. Did you catch that? It wasn't until they praised before the battle ever started, when they praised and gave thanks, then the enemies turned on themselves and there was no battle. Praise came first. The Israelites did not run in fear. They stood firm in faith. They didn't have to lift a finger. They just lifted their voices in worship, and their enemies self-destructed. There's power in praise. We don't often thank God for our trials, heartaches, and difficulties, although we're willing to praise Him for His goodness. We sometimes fail to realize that even adverse circumstances are blessings in disguise. Scottish preacher George Matheson had a problem. He realized that he was not as ready to praise God when things went wrong as he was when things went right. However, after he began to lose his eyesight, he changed his thinking. He struggled for some months with this weary burden until he reached the point where he could pray, "My God, I have never thanked you for my thorn. I have thanked you 1,000 times for my roses, but not once for my thorn. I have been looking forward to a world where I have been looking forward to a world where I shall get compensated for my cross, but I've never thought of my cross itself as a present glory. Teach me to value my thorn." We count our blessings, we should include the weaknesses, the hardships, the burdens, and the trials we face too, not just the good things that happen in our lives. 6, and the last thing, looking at Jehoshaphat and praying today, is expect God to turn battles into blessings. Expect God to turn battles into blessings. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 24 and 26, and also verse 29 and 30. 2 Chronicles 20, 24 and 26, and 2 Chronicles 20, 29 and 30. So when the army of Judah arrived at the lookout point in the wilderness, all they saw were dead bodies lying on the ground as far as they could see. Not a single one of the enemy had escaped. King Jehoshaphat and his men went out together to plunder. They found vast amounts of equipment, clothing, and other valuables, more than they could carry. There was so much plunder that it took them 3 days to collect it all. On the 4th day, they gathered in the Valley of Blessing, which got its name that day because the people praised and thanked the Lord there. It is still called the Valley of Blessing today. See, when you let God fight your battles, it's a witness to everyone around you. Everyone around you. Look at the other verses, 29 and 30 there. It says, when all the surrounding kingdoms heard that the Lord himself had fought against the enemies of Israel, the fear of the Lord came over them, so Jehoshaphat's kingdom was at peace, for he has given him rest on every side. So, when he turned to God, and he did all the things that he did, and let God fight his battle, God fought the battle, and then it was a witness to all of the heathen nations around what God had done when he had turned to God. He turns battles into blessings, is what happens. I'm going to ask if the worship team would come back up this morning.